Not a lot of people talk about the effects of the Chinese military intervention in the Vietnam War. Not only were the Americans engaged in large-scale military operations in a land far away from their own, but the two major communist powers, China and the Soviet Union, were also deeply involved. So today I'm going to be reading from three separate sources to tell the story. The JSTOR publication that's from the China Quarterly. I'm going to be quoting historian Chiang Ji, who wrote a book called China and the Vietnam Wars and gave an interview to the Wilson Center on it. I'm also going to be reading from the Washington Post article from 1989 when revelations first started coming out about China's involvement in the Vietnam War. So China sent 320,000 soldiers to Vietnam during the 1960s and spent over $20 billion to support Hanoi's regular North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong guerrilla units. The disclosure was made a month after military officials in the Soviet Union admitted that a contingent of Soviet advisors in Vietnam took part in combat against U.S. forces and helped shoot down American planes. Moscow had previously denied its troops played a combat role in the war. The agency report cited the History of the People's Republic of China, published by the Official State Archives Publishing House, as saying more than 4,000 Chinese soldiers were killed during the war. Fighting finally ended when victorious North Vietnamese tanks battled their way into the grounds of Dak La Palace in Saigon on April 30, 1975. During the war, U.S. intelligence reports said that U.S. combat units had found soldiers dressed in Chinese combat gear and wearing Chinese insignia, but Beijing at the time repeatedly denied U.S. allegations that its soldiers were operating in Vietnam during the 10 years of the direct involvement of the United States. American troop levels reached over 500,000. Estimates of North Vietnamese army units varied, but Hanoi maintained throughout the war that its soldiers were only as volunteers to help the Southern Viet Cong guerrilla movement. During the war, the U.S. had their hands tied. They had a policy of not invading North Vietnam, where the enemy strongholds were. They were afraid of a repeat of the Korean War, where China would send boots on the ground into Vietnam. China militarily supported North Vietnam, providing extensive logistical training and material aid. The historical background starts in 1949, when the People's Republic of China was first established in China. That's when the commies got in charge. In 1950, January, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was officially recognized by the PRC. The Chinese Communists came to power in 1949, and Ho Chi Minh went to China asking for help with his war against the French. Mao was eager to oblige, because he had the ambition of spreading his formula for making revolution to neighboring countries in Asia. He wanted to demonstrate that his formula for a people's war would apply within the Pan-Asian Communist movement. The Chinese helped the Vietnamese train their military commanders, reorganize their defense and financial systems, including tax and fiscal policy, and create a solid economic base. They also helped the Vietnamese to mobilize the peasants to support war through land reform campaigns. Overall, there was a massive transfer of the Chinese experience of making revolution to the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh was very eager to learn in Vietnam. He was essentially following a long-established pattern of interactions between the Chinese and Vietnamese. If you look back in history, Vietnamese emperors and leaders looked to China for models of how to do farming, how to modernize their society, and so on. They readily adapted Confucian values and institutions. I should add, the Chinese-Vietnamese relationship wasn't a simple one-sided teacher-student. There's another side to the picture, full of tension and friction. The Chinese government, under the administration of Mao Zedong, took an active role in the First Indochina War. In April 1950, the Viet Minh formally requested military aid, including equipment, advisors, and training. The PRC began to send their advisors and later formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group, led by General Hua Gao-ching, along with Senior General Chen Jiang. There was a friction between the two countries. For instance, the Chinese, who came to advise the Vietnamese in the early 1950s, had trouble getting along with Vietnamese commanders who saw them as arrogant and condescending. This, of course, fits the historical pattern. Vietnam was eager to learn from China, but is also afraid of losing its independence. The two countries have a classic love-hate relationship. China towers over Vietnam. It's a much bigger country with a more advanced civilization. And this makes the Vietnamese feel insecure. They resent living in China's shadow. This was the beginning of China's assistance. So throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s, Mao considered the United States the primary threat to China's security and revolution. Indochina constituted one of the three fronts, the other being Korea and Taiwan, that Mao perceived as vulnerable to invasion by imperialist countries. Thus, Mao's support for Ho Chi Minh started with the security concern. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the deteriorating relations between China and the Soviet Union, especially after the Sino-Soviet border conflict in March of 1969, Mao further clarified that the Soviet Union was the primary threat to China's national security. Then he began to adjust his policies to America and encouraged the North Vietnamese to conclude a peace settlement. The sense of an international responsibility to help brotherly comrades and promote anti-imperialist revolution was another crucial factor in Beijing's Indochina policy. In believing that China had a special role to play in reshaping of a future revolutionary order in the world, Mao aimed at transforming not only the old China, but also the old world order. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Beijing's propaganda expressed it to be a natural ally of the oppressed people of the world in their struggle for national liberation. The intention to use international struggle to promote domestic political agendas often figured prominently in Mao's deliberations on Vietnam. In his opinion, perception of China facing serious external threats would be an effective instrument to help strengthen the dynamics of revolutionary mobilization at home, as well as his authority and controlling position in China and the political life there. Thus, aiding Vietnam served Mao's purpose of getting support to reshape the Chinese state and society. So the Chinese Military Advisory Group and the Viet Minh began training for their first campaign. In September 1950, the border campaigns were launched, and between April and September 1950, China sent the Viet Minh 14,000 rifles and pistols, 1,700 machine guns and recoilless rifles, 150 mortars, 60 artillery pieces, and 300 bazookas, as well as ammo, medicine, communications materials, clothes, and 2,800 tons of food. In addition, a political advisory group was also sent from China to northern Vietnam in 1950, led by Lao Guabao. Lao went to Tonkin to pass on China's experience in financial and economic work. They changed the cadre's ideology and working style, government work and mobilization of the masses. Between 1951 and 1954, the Chinese helped the Vietnamese in training their military commanders, reorganizing their defense and financial systems. They also helped the Vietnamese to mobilize the peasants to support the war through land reform campaigns. In the years following the conclusion of the 1954 Geneva Conference, China desired a peaceful international environment in order to focus on domestic reconstruction, while Communist Party of Vietnam faced two fundamental tasks: to reconstruct the North and to unify the South. To rebuild the North, the CPV immediately got assistance from China after the Geneva Conference. To help the DRV relieve famine, rebuild the transportation systems, and revive agriculture, reconstruct the urban economy, and improve the armed forces, Beijing agreed to provide rice, sent a team of economic advisors and experts to North Vietnam. In December 1954, China sent more than 2,000 railroad workers to the DRV to repair railway lines, roads, and bridges. During Ho Chi Minh's official visit to China in 1955, Beijing agreed to provide a grant of $200 million to be used to build various projects. After that, they also established a manpower exchange program. Between 1955 and 1957, in addition to assistance from China, the Soviet Union also played an important role in helping the DRV reconstruct and develop its economy. Hanoi kept asking Beijing for military aid. Under these circumstances, and in response to Hanoi's request in Vietnam, China offered substantial military aid to Vietnam before 1963. According to Chinese sources, during 1956 to 1963 period, China's military aid to Vietnam totaled 320 million yuan, which is that roughly translates to many billion today. China's arms shipments to Vietnam, including 270,000 guns at this point, over 10,000 pieces of artillery, 200 million bullets of different types, 2 million artillery shells, 15,000 wire transmitters, radio transmitters, over 1,000 trucks, 15 planes, 28 naval vessels, and 1.8 million sets of military uniforms. It was China's aid to North Vietnam from 1955 to 1963 that effectively gave the North the resources they need to begin an insurgency in the South. The Chinese gave Ho Chi Minh and his movement a lot of support, but this didn't mean that he was a China puppet. He was his own master, he saw himself that way, and he decided that he wanted to set his own agenda. Sometimes this conflicted with what China had in mind. The clearest example of this occurred following the Geneva Conference in 1954. After that conference, the French withdrew from Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh had the dream of expanding his success from north to south and unifying the country. This worried the Chinese. They feared it might trigger an American intervention. After all, China had just fought the Korean War against the Americans, and this had placed enormous stress on his economy. So when the French withdrew from Vietnam in 1954, the Chinese very much wanted a relaxation of tensions in Southeast Asia. They didn't want to fight another Korean War in Vietnam. The Soviets shared the Chinese instinct for preventing another war in Asia. Soviets and the Chinese together pressured Ho Chi Minh to stop at the 17th parallel, the dividing line between North and South Vietnam established at the Geneva Conference. The Vietnamese later accused the Chinese of betraying their interests at this critical juncture. The catalyst for the Vietnam War would be the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. To confront the increasing U.S. pressure in Indochina, Beijing stepped up its coordination with the Vietnamese and Laotian parties. People's Liberation Army units in areas bordering Vietnam increased their numbers, and China began providing military assistance to North Vietnam at a greater rate. In response to U.S. bombing of North Vietnam, China launched what was called the Resist America Aid Vietnam campaign. The campaign themes denounced U.S. imperialism and promoted Vietnamese resistance. Local Communist Party cadre organized mass meetings and street demonstrations, and millions of people across the country marched in support of the campaign. From February 9th to February 11th, 1965. The Communist Party expanded the campaign into cultural media such as films and photography exhibitions, singing contests, and street performances. In April 1965, the U.S. Operation Rolling Thunder prompted the Communist Party to accelerate war preparations in major cities, particularly air defense and citizen militia drills. The party began emphasizing that in addition to preparing for the risk of U.S. bombing of China, the Chinese people should be prepared to handle the worst-case scenario of having to fight on Chinese soil. To counter U.S. overwhelming airstrikes, Ho Chi Minh requested Chinese anti-aircraft artillery units in a meeting with Mao in May 1965. So the Vietnamese leader and the Chinese leader are meeting to discuss how do we stop the Americans. In response, People's Liberation Army forces began flowing into North Vietnam in July 1965 to help defend Hanoi and its major transportation systems. The total number of Chinese troops in North Vietnam between 1965 and 1968 amounted to over 320,000. The peak year was 1967, when 170,000 Chinese soldiers were present. In the same year, the PLA and the People's Army of Vietnam made an agreement under which the PLA provided thousands of tons of rice, uniforms, meat, fish, beans, and even over 100,000 cigarettes, and most importantly, about 17 million rounds of artillery shells over a period of 10 years. Such allowed Hanoi to use its own manpower for participating in battles in the South and maintaining the transport and communications lines between the North and South, and played a role in deterring further American expansion of the war into the North. China's supply of weapons and other military equipment to Vietnam sharply increased in 1965 compared to 1964. The amount of China's military supply fluctuated between 65 and 68, although the total value of material supplies remains at roughly the same level. But then, in 69 and 70, there was a sharp drop. At the same time, China's troops were pulled back. Not until 1972 would there be another significant increase in China's military delivery to Vietnam. Another figure shows that when the last Chinese troops withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, 1,100 Chinese soldiers had lost their lives and 4,200 had been wounded. In 1968, China's strategic environment changed as Sino-Soviet relations took a decisively turn for the worse. When China was seeking rapprochement with America, North Vietnam was still locked in a desperate struggle with the Americans, which created serious implications for the Sino-DRV relations between China and North Vietnam, and China's assistance to North Vietnam declined over 1969 to 1970. So Jia Chen argues that China, as a beneficiary of the agreement, desired to tackle domestic problems rather than get involved in another direct Sino-American confrontation after what happened in the Korean War. Zhou repeatedly emphasized that the unification should be regarded as a long-term struggle, and that only when the North had been consolidated with extensive efforts would it become possible to talk about how to win over the South and how to unify the country. Thus, he concluded that the leaders in Beijing never engaged Hanoi to liberate the South militarily. Mao Zedong's theory of world revolution determined China's response in using military force to aid North Vietnam and resist the United States. Beijing may have only wished to deter, not confront Washington. However, American policymakers had a different interpretation. They perceived the battles in South Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia as a crucial signal of further communist expansion. Thus, America's interests in the military involvement in the Vietnam War intensified. Lin mentioned that during the Johnson administration, the Vietnam War escalated, a major reason being the sense of threat brought by China's wars of national liberation in Vietnam. However, from the American perspective, such aid was a bigger plot, and Johnson feared communist expansion in Asia during his administration. The perspective of his article and his interpretation of American policymakers are different from former works based on Chinese historical sources. To a large extent, the interaction between China and the United States determined each other's participation during the Vietnam War. China worried about the response of the United States, which feared that China was a more radical and militant communist power in Asia. The Vietnamese memory of the 1954 Geneva Conference, and more importantly, the need to maintain Soviet aid, which meant that Hanoi had to keep Beijing at a distance. However, bilateral relations between the two Asian allies on the eve of the Tet Offensive were strained. By 1968, the foundation that Sino-Vietnamese relations began to crack under the weight of the Soviet factor. It was Hanoi's decision to enter into negotiations with Washington as a result of the military stalemate in the wake of the Tet Offensive that dealt the first major blow to Sino-Vietnamese relations during the Second Indochina War. In a sense, if the 1968 offensive planted a seed of doubt in Chinese thinking regarding Soviet influence in North Vietnam, the initiation of negotiations in Paris sprouted paranoia. According to historian Christopher Gosch, the Vietnamese were greatly relieved to have Chinese support. The military aid and training China provided were vital to Vietnamese defeat of the French. They also sent political advisors to remold the Vietnamese state, economy, and agricultural system in communist ways. And relations changed in the late 1960s as the Cultural Revolution and Maoist visions of permanent revolutionary struggle ran up against important and geostrategic differences in Vietnam in the war against the United States. Nonetheless, the Chinese continued to supply massive amounts of military and economic aid, as well as sending over 300,000 military troops to support in North Vietnam. So that's the story of Chinese intervention in Vietnam. I thought it was a really interesting story that I never heard about before when people discuss the Vietnam War. Occasionally you'll hear rumors of how the Soviet Union, it came out later that they were really helping and supporting the North Vietnam against the Americans, but you don't hear about the massive amount of support that China sent. Again, all this information only really came out in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union fell. So let me know what you think of this story. Was it interesting? Do you want to see more historical rundowns like this? Be sure to check out the 3 separate sources that I read directly from throughout this. This was not one of our original research and analysis things that we do on the main channel. I was reading straight from the China Quarterly JSTOR publication and also from the book called China and the Vietnam Wars. The author of that gave an interview to the Wilson Center. Check those out. It's also There's that Washington Post article from 1989. All the links are in the description.